I think, for the University of Florida, and it's a critical initiative for the Shorenstein Center as well. Particularly this year for 2024, because the series of events we will have for the forum this year addresses understanding the new wave of anti-Semitism. Now, the founders of this forum are two dear supporters of ours, Audrey Adams, who is a member of our advisory board, and Dr. John Morris, Professor Emeritus of the School of Journalism. I can't tell you how important it is to have support, but it's even better to have trust, that two friends trust us with something that they see as this important is more wonderful than I can say, and I just want to acknowledge them very quickly. Now, like I said, this year's theme is understanding the new anti-Semitism, and you cannot find a better speaker on anti-Semitism today than my friend Jeffery Herf, who is Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Maryland. Jeffery is one of the preeminent, I would say, the preeminent authority on anti-Semitism and scholarship on anti-Semitism today. And he's written more books than I can mention, but I will say that they're not just books, they're books that change the way you think about major issues. I'll mention a few: Reactionary Modernism, Technology, Culture, and Politics in Weimar and the Third Reich is translated into how many languages? Something like a dozen or something like that. You can't get through a graduate seminar without reading it. Divided Memory, The Nazi Past in the Two Germanys, was one of the first books ever to use recently opened East German archives. The Jewish Enemy, Nazi propaganda during the World War II and the Holocaust is a thorough examination of Nazi narratives about the global Jewish conspiracy that the Nazis imagined they were fighting. Nazi propaganda for the Arab world, which I think might be discussed a little bit tonight, involves just what it says, the way the Nazis sort of interacted with certain Arabs to propagandize the Middle East against the Jews. Undeclared wars with Israel, East Germany, the West German far left, and their affinities with the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And then more recently in 2022, I urge everyone to read Israel's Moment, international support for and action against the founding of the State of Israel from 1945 to 1949. But his most recent book, which came out just a few months ago, is The Three Faces of Anti-Semitism, Right, Left, Islamist. This is a very important combination of subjects which isn't being discussed nearly enough on college campuses today or anywhere else. In fact, to my knowledge, I think this is the only college campus that is even having a serious series on understanding the new wave of anti-Semitism. I can't mention all of his edited collections, all of the important essays that he has written for opinion journals, but if you Google his name, Jeffery Herf, you will find them. Tonight, his talk is entitled Hamas in Historical Context, Islamism, Nazism, and the Aftershocks of World War II and the Holocaust. Everyone, would you please welcome Jeffery Herf.
Thank you, Norman. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Adams, Dr. Morris, Mr. Shorenstein. It's a great pleasure to be here this evening. The University of Florida is blessed with Norman Goda, and we're friends for many, many years, And I'm so pleased to see what Norman has accomplished here at the University of Florida, the Center for Jewish Studies. This university should be very, very proud of what has happened here, because it is unique, unfortunately. Well, let's get to it. In Three Faces of Anti-Semitism, Right, Left, and Islamist, I describe our current era in the United States and Europe as one of simultaneity. By that I mean that antagonism to Judaism, the Jewish people, and then to the state of Israel comes at the same time from the far right, from the anti-Zionist left, and from Islamists, whether they're in the government of Iran and or the organization of Hezbollah in Lebanon, or the mini-state in Gaza that was run by Hamas. The polarization of American intellectual and political life means that, with too few exceptions, conservatives focus on the anti-Semitism of the Islamists on the left, while liberals and leftists warn of the far right and the flirtation with it by Trumpists in the United States. It's a distinctive feature of Three Faces of Anti-Semitism that in the same volume, it includes essays on all three of these forms of anti-Semitism. It's my little effort, not so little, my effort to strike a blow against intellectual and political polarization. Those of you who are familiar with the published works that Norman mentioned know that this body of work is distinctive in addressing the anti-Semitism that accompanied the Holocaust, the Nazis, the Islamist collaboration with the Nazis, and the Soviet era and radical leftist anti-Semitism of the Cold War and the years since. In their penchant for conspiracy theories, in their view that the very small number of Jews on this globe have enormous power, and that they use this power for the destruction of all good things, in their penchant for these conspiracy theories, these three variations of anti-Semitism reinforce one another. They are all dangerous, and they are all built on lies. They all deserve criticism and examination. They are a threat to the Jews, and they are a threat to liberal democracy. However, this evening, I'm going to focus on the aggression of Hamas on October 7th. It is fresh in our minds, and therefore I'm going to focus on one of the three faces, the Islamist face. As you may have read, in the aftermath of the mass murders of October 7, there were open letters and signed statements in some universities, including my own, placing the attacks of that day into a historical context. And the historical context that they referred to was 75 years of Israeli occupation, dispossession, and repression of the Palestinians. Chanting "Free Palestine from the river to the sea," activists justified the attacks by arguing, in effect, that once again, the Jews, or rather the Zionists or the Israelis, were guilty, and they got what they deserved. In the universities, in the press, and in the famous human rights organizations, one heard far less about another historical context, the one I plan to speak about this evening. It is the context of the core ideological beliefs of the Islamic resistance movement called Hamas, and of the now almost 90-year history of the Islamism from which it emerged in Egypt. That history began in the late 1930s. Islamists attained global attention when they collaborated with Nazi Germany during World War II and the Holocaust. The Islamists were crucial to the Arab decision of December 1947 to reject the United Nations partition resolution, which would have created a Palestinian state as well as a Jewish state in former British Mandate Palestine. It was crucial for the decision to launch the war, the Civil War of 1947, and for the Arab invasion of May of 1948. It was crucial to reject every effort of compromise offered by Israel since, in its charter, or sometimes called Covenant, of 1988, Hamas expressed the blend of Islamist Jew hatred with modern conspiracy theories of Nazism. Its terrorist attacks in the 1990s in Israel, seizure of power in Gaza in 2007, establishment of the mini-dictatorship that turned Gaza Strip into a fortress to wage war on Israel, The thousands of rockets fired at Israel since, and the mass murders of October 7th were all translations of its core beliefs into policy and action. Over that 90-year history, the simultaneity of anti-Semitism's three phases has contributed to the emergence and persistence of this specifically Islamist form. So I want to draw your attention to some key documents of this historical context. In September of 1937, Haj Amin al-Husseini, appointed in the 1920s by the British to be the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, was a man on the run because the British authorities in Mandate Palestine were seeking to arrest him for his role in supporting terror against the Jews in Palestine and terror against more moderate Arabs who were entertaining a compromise with the immigrant Jews. In his absence in 1937, he had a text read at a conference in Blue Don, Syria. In 1938, the speech entitled Islam and the Jews was published in German translation in Berlin. It was not the result of Nazi propaganda, but it was the result of Husseini's own interpretation of the Quran and the biography of Muhammad. In that canonical text of the Islamist tradition, Husseini said, "The battle between the Jews and Islam began when Muhammad fled from Mecca to Medina. In those days, the Jewish methods were exactly the same as they are today in the 20th century. Then, as now, slander was their weapon. They said Muhammad was a swindler. They tried to undermine his honor. They began to pose senseless and unanswerable questions to Muhammad, and then they tried to annihilate the Muslims. And just as the Jews were able to betray Muhammad, so they will betray the Muslims today. The verses of the Quran and the Hadith," he said, "assert that the Jews were Islam's most bitter enemy, and moreover, the Jews try to destroy Islam." Haj Amin al-Husseini in 1937 argued that the Zionist project was only the most recent of 7 centuries of Jewish attacks on the religion of Islam, and therefore the effort to prevent the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine was a religious obligation of all Muslims. The conflict over territory and borders was, in his view, a conflict between Judaism and Islam, and therefore he was launching a war of religion. Husseini arrived in Nazi Berlin in November of 1941. There he met Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop and then Hitler himself. There's a famous picture, which is not on the PowerPoint, which was famous at the time in the newspapers around the world, showing Haj Amin al-Husseini speaking with Hitler. He arrived with an entourage, including the talented radio announcer Yunus Bari. My Nazi Propaganda for the Arab World, published by Yale University Press in 2009, draws on German archives and the translations done by American diplomats in Cairo to offer the fullest account of the 4 years of anti-Jewish hatred contained in Nazi Germany's Arabic language radio broadcasts. Occasionally, Husseini spoke in his own name, as he did on December 23rd in 1942 in an address at the opening of the Islamic Institute in Berlin. He brought the themes of Islam and the Jews to bear on World War II, and this was published in German and it was broadcast in Arabic on Nazi Germany's shortwave radio broadcast to North Africa and the Middle East. This is Husseini, as translated by American diplomats in Cairo. The Quran says that they, the Jews, beat the cauldron of war and bring corruption on the earth, and God doesn't like those who are corrupt. Such are their ways. Even in this war, World War II, they have brought about the clash between different opinions, and as Chaim Weizmann said, The war is a Jewish war. The idea that World War II was a Jewish war was a core theme of Nazi propaganda in Europe and in Germany. And in point of fact, world Jewry, Husseini claimed, dictates the war, as was the case during the days of Muhammad. The Jews have spread their influence over Britain. They dominate America. The Jews are behind destructive and atheist communism. They have brought people against each other, and the catastrophes and the tragedies that are happening now, that is World War II, are caused by the Jews. The first enemies of the Muslims are today the Jews and the British and the Americans who support them. Here, Husseini was echoing Hitler and Nazi propaganda that the Second World War was something called a Jewish war. Hitler had said publicly, and I make that the evidence is in my book, The Jewish Enemy, and in some of the essays in Three Faces of Antisemitism. Hitler said that the Jews intended to exterminate the Germans. And he said it publicly and famously on more than one occasion. Husseini and others participating in Nazi Germany's Arabic propaganda added another element to the Jews' sinister plans. On November 3rd, 1943, the Voice of Free Arabism, in its Berlin program, broadcast a message entitled Palestine Between the Bolsheviks and the Jews. Palestine between Bolsheviks and the Jews. And in that broadcast, the Arabic language speaker on Nazi radio asserted that the Jews, especially in Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, quote, kindled this war, the Second World War, kindled this war in the interests of Zionism. The world will never be at peace until the Jewish race is exterminated, otherwise wars will always exist. The Jews are the germs which have caused the trouble in the world. Although President Franklin Roosevelt's views on Zionism remained ambiguous during the war, public support for the Zionist project grew in response to the news of the mass murders of the Jews in Europe, public support in Washington. It was evident in a resolution written by Senator Wagner of New York and Taft of Ohio, expressing support for the establishment of a Jewish home in Palestine. Husseini said the following in a broadcast in March 1944 in response to this upsurge in Washington of support for the Zionist project and outrage over the Holocaust. Quote, "The wicked American intentions toward the Arabs are now clearer, and there remains no doubt that they are endeavoring to establish a Jewish empire in the Arab world. More than 400 million Arabs oppose this criminal American involvement." And then, speaking in his own voice, Husseini said, "Arabs, rise as one," and the emphasis is in the original text. "Arabs, rise as one and fight for your sacred rights. Kill the Jews wherever you find them. This pleases God and history. This serves your honor. God is with you." Already in the last year of World War II, the Brooklyn congressman and spark plug of the House of Representatives, a great, great politician, Emanuel Seller, urged that Haj Amin al-Husseini and other foreign collaborators with the Nazis be included among those to be indicted in war crimes trials that were then being planned in Washington and London. Senator Robert F. Wagner of New York, many of you will recall he was one of the lions of the New Deal, author of the Social Security, one of the authors of the Social Security Act. Senator Robert Wagner, liberal and left-leaning journalists such as Frida Kirchway, the editor of the left-leaning Nation magazine, I.F. Stone, writing in the Nation, and the New York local paper, PM, which was even a more left-leaning publication, as well as Alexander Uhl, writing in those days, very left-liberal New York Post, very different from today's Post. They joined Rabbi Stephen Wise and Rabbi Abba Silber in the American Zionist Emergency Council in a completely unsuccessful effort to bring what was called the Mufti, Husseini, to one of the post-war war crimes trials. Without success, they urged the French government, which held him under house arrest from May of 45 to June of 46, to extradite him to Britain to a war crimes trial. And in the process, Wise and Silber and the American Zionist Emergency Council produced a remarkable amount of material regarding his wartime collaboration with Nazi Germany. Certainly enough material to justify an indictment. And they sent the material to the State Department in Washington in the summer of 1945. Nevertheless, as the files of the French Foreign Ministry make clear, the French government decided that sending Husseini to be tried for war crimes would damage French interests in North Africa and the Middle East. His house arrest at a villa outside Paris was so lenient that he was able to escape in disguise and fly on a TWA flight to Cairo in June of 1946. The government of Egypt, faced with requests from Britain and the United States that he be extradited for trial, the government of Egypt granted him asylum and provided a significant security detail around his home. He received a hero's welcome in Cairo. The most enthusiastic aspect of his returning welcome came from a man named Hassan al-Banna. Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, the vanguard organization of the Islamist tradition. And I want to be extremely clear. Islamism is an interpretation of the religion of Islam. As a European historian, as a historian of Nazism, I can tell you that overwhelmingly, if you ask historians of the Holocaust or historians of Nazism, did Christianity have anything to do with this? The vast majority of my colleagues will say interpretations of Christianity certainly had a great deal to do with it. When Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt signed the Atlantic Charter off the coast of Newfoundland in 1941, Winston Churchill suggested to the president that at the end of the meeting, they sing a song. And you can go to YouTube and you can see Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill singing that song. And it's a profoundly important song. And the song that they sang was Onward Christian Soldiers. Because for Churchill and Roosevelt, both of whom came from a philo-Semitic Protestant tradition, the Second World War was a war about many things. But one of the things that it was about was the assertion that Christianity as a whole did not stand for hatred of the Jews. That was one of the reasons, that was one of the things that war was about for Winston Churchill, that there was a different Christianity. But for Hitler, on occasion, there were bishops who came to his office and said, you shouldn't be doing this or you shouldn't be doing that. And Hitler threw them out of his, I don't know if he threw him out of his office, but he replied, what have you, the Protestant and Catholic Church, has been saying for these many centuries about the Jews? It's just implausible that this has nothing to do with what we're doing. So my point is a point about a historian, the way historians think about these things, that there is an interpretation of Christianity that the Nazis expressed, which had some textual basis. Christianity is a huge tradition and can be interpreted in many different ways, as the contrast between Hitler's interpretation and Churchill and Roosevelt's interpretation makes clear. Well, the exact same methodological issues apply to the interpretation of Islam. There are many different ways of interpreting the religion of Islam. One of those ways is called Islamism. And Hassan al-Banna, the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, was central to not only that intellectual interpretation or theological interpretation of the religion of Islam, but then translating it into a massive organization called the Muslim Brotherhood. On June 11th of 1946, Hassan al-Banna issued the following statement. The hearts of the Arabs palpitated with joy at hearing that the Mufti has succeeded in reaching an Arab country. The news sounded like thunder to the ears of some American, British, and Jewish tyrants. The lion is at last free. He will roam the Arabian jungle to clear it of the wolves. What a hero and what a miracle of a man. Yes, this hero who challenged an empire and fought Zionism with the help of Hitler and Germany. Germany and Hitler are gone, but Amin al-Husseini will continue the struggle. The Lord Almighty did not preserve Amin for nothing. There must be a divine purpose behind the preservation of the life of this man, namely the defeat of Zionism. Amin, march on. God is with you. We are behind you. We are willing to sacrifice our necks for the cause. To death, forward march. al-Banna's remarkable statement made clear that Husseini would continue the struggle against the Jews, and now this struggle was the defeat of Zionism. As my dear friend, the German historian and political scientist Matthias Kunzel has put it well in his recently published English translation, Nazis, Islamic Anti-Semitism in the Middle East, the rejection of the UN partition resolution in 1947 and then the Arab decision to wage war against the new Jewish states of Israel were aftershocks and continuations of the war against the Jews in which Husseini had collaborated during the Holocaust. The war of religion, announced in Islam and the Jews in 1937, continued in the war of 1948, a war which for the Islamists was never only about land and borders, but always about eliminating any Jewish presence in what British Mandate Palestine had been. The Islamists' rejection of any Jewish state in Palestine after World War II, as well as their decision to collaborate with the Nazi regime during the war, were due to deep-seated ideological convictions. Husseini was emphatic when people suggested that his collaboration was only a matter of tactics and opportunism. He said, no, it was because we shared some deep-seated views, above all, hatred of the Jews. From 1948 to the establishment of the Islamic Republic of Iran in 1979-80, Islamist organizations faded into the political background of world politics. Their support for Nazi Germany and their religiously grounded hatred of Judaism, the Jews, and therefore of the State of Israel were disqualifying features in a post-war world which had fresh memories of the horrors of Nazism and the Holocaust. During the crucial years of 1947-48, the diplomatic and military support by the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc was crucial for the establishment of the State of Israel, far more than many people realize in this country. And it stood in contrast to the opposition to the Zionist project in the United States State Department and Defense Departments. But once it became clear to Stalin that the new State of Israel was not going to be an instrument of Soviet expansion in the Middle East, as he had hoped, and as George Marshall's State Department feared, as soon as he came to that understanding, as soon as David Ben-Gurion formed a coalition government which did not include the pro-Soviet parties in Israel, Stalin turned against Israel. There followed 4 decades of Soviet anti-Zionism, decades which comprised a secular bridge between the Islamists of the 1940s and those of the 1980s. Soviet propagandists completely rewrote the history of the War of 1948, repressed the anti-colonial, anti-racist, and anti-Nazi nature of the Zionist project, and articulated instead a tale of Zionist perfidy, racism, and colonialism that echoed around the world. The Soviet Union placed the global prestige of anti-fascism and of the Red Army's victory over Nazism in the service of a campaign to delegitimate the State of Israel. And in the process, it succeeded in making the word Zionist a term of abuse, and the cause of the Palestinians a cause célèbre of the radical left. What had been the Jewish question before 1948 became the Israel question. The Palestine Liberation Organization engaged in terrorist attacks on Israel, all the while insisting that it was, quote, only opposed to Zionism, but not to the Jews. If one assumes, as I do, that any effort to destroy the state of Israel by war is a form of anti-Semitism, then this secular form was unique in the history of anti-Semitism for insisting that engaging in terrorist attacks against Israelis was not a form of anti-Semitism at all. The effect of these decades of secular antagonism to Israel was to justify armed assaults on what it described as a racist and settler colonialist state, and to make the view compatible with the outlook of the international radical left. Indeed, as my friend and writer Paul Berman pointed out in his 2004 book, Terror and Liberalism, a great book, terrorism of those years, and of 9/11 as well, also had the effect of increasing sympathy for the terrorist cause, because many asked, after all, why would people resort to such terrorist tactics unless there must have been some terrible injustice that inspired them? It was in this climate of antagonism to Israel in the 1970s that the Islamic Resistance Movement, or Hamas, published its founding covenant, or charter, in 1988. It's important, and it's very easy to read. It's 9,000 words and 36 articles, because in 2008, the English translation was posted on the website of the Avalon Project in Law, History, and Diplomacy of the Yale Law School. And while Yale's and Harvard people debate about which is the greatest university in the world, there's no question that Yale Law School is an important place. The charter is essential reading for anyone who wants to understand why the current war happened. A war that never should have happened and could have been prevented, in my view. It's essential reading for understanding everything that Hamas has done, not just since on October 7th, but everything it has done since the 1990s. We historians of Nazism, and the generation of historians who came before my generation, speak about something called the fatal underestimation of Hitler, the fatal underestimation of the seriousness and centrality of his Jew hatred. We are in, and we have lived through, a second era of underestimation. And the underestimation of our recent decades is the underestimation of Hamas's ideology and its determination to unite a truly evil ideology with murderous practice. There just is no substitute for reading the whole charter. Here are some of its key passages and themes. In the name of the most merciful Allah, it quotes the martyr Imam Hassan al-Banna of blessed memory, that Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, just as it had obliterated others before it, unquote. The charter dispenses with the acrobatics of the PLO and Arafat's speaking about we're only anti-Zionists when he's speaking in English and then speaking more frankly in Arabic. It dispensed with all that acrobatics. Oh, we're not really anti-Semites. It dispensed with the idea that efforts to obliterate the state of Israel was not a form of antagonism to Jews. It states, quote, our struggle against the Jews is very great and very serious, unquote. It stresses its connections to the Muslim Brotherhood and declares that by, quote, adapting Islam as its way of life, the movement goes back to the time of the birth of the Islamic message, of the righteous ancestor. For Allah is its target, the Prophet is its example, and the Quran is its constitution, unquote. It presents itself as an interpretation of the religion of Islam and evokes the spirit of the 7th century. Its goal is now to raise the banner of Allah, quote, to raise the banner of Allah over every inch of Palestine, unquote. And by Palestine, it is referring to what in 1988 included all of the state of Israel. It was never, ever just about the occupation of the West Bank. It presented this effort to obliterate the state of Israel as an Islamic religious obligation. Quote, the prophet, Allah bless him and grant him salvation, has said, the day of judgment will not come about until Muslims fight the Jews, killing the Jews, when the Jew will hide behind stones and trees. The stones and trees will say, oh, Muslims, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him. Only the garka tree, evidently a certain kind of tree, would not do that because it is one of the trees of the Jews, unquote. The charter celebrated the destruction of Israel to be part of an apocalyptic, murderous theodicy, and that the killing of the Jews was essential in order to bring about a redemptive world. Article 7 describes Hamas as one of the links in the chain of the struggle against the Zionist invaders of 1939, the War of 1948, and the, quote, the jihad operations of the Muslim Brotherhood in 1968 and after. And by jihad operations, they were not referring to efforts to restore the soul or have an inner emotional, intellectual revival. They were talking about terrorism and war. Article 11 reasserted that, quote, the land of Palestine is an Islamic property or a waqf, and that it is consecrated for future Muslim generations until Judgment Day. It or any part of it should not be squandered. It or any part of it should not be given up. Article 13 rejected international conferences or negotiations. Quote, there is no solution for the Palestinian question except through jihad. Initiatives, proposals, and international organizations are all a waste of time and vain endeavors, unquote. Jihad in this context meant the waging of war against Israel. The famous Article 22. The famous Article 22. Most of the articles of the Hamas Charter of 1988 are an interpretation of the religion of Islam. They have nothing to do with Nazism. They are the indigenous, autonomous, Islamist interpretation of the religion of Islam. They are not the impact of the Nazis. And keep in mind that the charter was issued in 1988, 43 years after Hitler died. So one of the interesting issues that historians are debating is how important was the collaboration with the Nazis, how important were these views a result of the Islamist interpretation. But let's turn to Article 22, the famous Article 22. Famous because more than any other part of the Charter, it clearly indicated the impact of the secular anti-Semitic conspiracy theories of 20th century Europe, from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion to Nazi propaganda during the war. Here are large sections of Article 22. The Jews, quote, with their money, took control of the world media, news agencies, the press, publishing houses, broadcasting stations, and others. With their money, stirred revolutions in various parts of the world with the purpose of achieving their interests and reaping the fruit therein. With their money, were behind the French Revolution, the Communist Revolution, and most of the revolutions we heard and hear about here and there. With their money, formed secret societies such as the Freemasons, the Rotary Clubs, the Lions, and others in different parts of the world for the purpose of sabotaging societies and achieving Zionist interests. And with their money, were able to control imperialist countries and instigate them to colonize many countries in order to enable them to exploit their resources and spread corruption. It goes on. They were behind World War I when they were able to destroy the Islamic Caliphate. They obtained the Balfour Declaration. They formed the League of Nations, through which they could rule the world. They were behind World War II, through which they made huge financial gains by trading in armaments and paved the way for the establishment of their state. It was they who instigated the replacement of the League of Nations with the United Nations and the Security Council to enable them to rule the world through them. There is no war going on anywhere without having their finger in it. And as of 2008, anybody with a computer and a mouse and a few clicks could find that statement at the Yale Law School Avalon Project website. In attributing sinister and vast powers to the Jews, Article 22 echoed the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and those of the propaganda of Nazi regime. The idea that the Jews were the cause of World War II, which then, quote, paved the way to the establishment of Israel, recalled Nazi Germany's Arabic language radio broadcasts that asserted, for example, as I indicated before, that the Jews, quote, kindled this war in the interest of Zionism. The Nazi influences in the Hamas Charter of 1988 were now visible to a scholarly and policy and political readership. Another important theme of Nazi Germany's Arabic language propaganda was that a Jewish state in Palestine would threaten other Arab states. Article 32 stated, "Today it is Palestine. Tomorrow it will be one country after another. The Zionist plan is limitless. After Palestine, the Zionists aspire to expand from the Nile to the Euphrates. When they will have digested the region they overtook, they will aspire to further expansion. The plan is embodied, quote, in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and their present conduct is the best proof of what we are saying." So by 2008, the American political establishment, the American Academy, journalists at our leading newspapers, and the broadcast networks all had textual evidence easily at their disposal, not to mention professors, had easy access at this blend of religious fundamentalism with Nazi ideology, which together were fanning the flames of a religious war against the Jews and therefore against the existence of the State of Israel. On January 5th of 1993, the Washington Post published 5 paragraphs from the 36 articles. The first mention of the charter in the New York Times appeared on April 16th, 2009, in a very fine 220-word letter to the editor by the late Israeli political theorist Shlomo Avineri on April 16th. In the years since, the Times has not published extensive sections of the charter, nor has it offered its readers an article that fully presented the core arguments that I've presented to you this evening. In 2003, in the aftermath of al-Qaeda's attacks of 9/11, Sa-Ira, a small left-leaning press in Freiburg, Germany, published Matthias Kunzel's Jihad und Judenhass über die neuen jüdischen Krieg, Jihad and Jew hatred on the new war against the Jews. As far as I know, Matthias Kunzel's book was the first extended public description of the Charter and its significance by any scholar in Israel, Europe, or the United States, and that was in 2003. He described the Charter as probably the most important programmatic document of contemporary Islamism. And as I've indicated to you now on several occasions, it was posted in 2008 in the Avalon Project. In 1998, the essential and superb historian of Islamism and of Iran, Meir Litvak at the Dayan Center of Tel Aviv University, published his first article about the Islamization of the conflict between the Palestinians and Israel. In 2010, he published Martyrdom in Life, Jihad and Martyrdom in the Ideology of Hamas in the journal Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, edited by Bruce Hoffman at Georgetown University. Judging from published articles, this, quote, most important document of contemporary Islamism aroused little interest among journalists, human rights organizations, most scholars focused on the Middle East, and also scholars working on Jewish and Israel studies. In the vast effort of the war on terror, officials in the Bush and Obama administrations did not draw public attention to the Hamas Charter and its renewal of war against the Jews. The lack of attention in the academy to the Charter's Islamic dimensions of Jew hatred and hatred of Israel found a counterpart in the paucity of attention in public discussion. Indeed, with the coming of the term Islamophobia, those who examined the topic risked being themselves accused of racism. In 2017, Hamas issued a statement that adopted more of the secular language of anti-Zionism made famous by the Palestine Liberation Organization. Yet that text remained true to the spirit of the founding charter. It rejected any alternative, quote, any alternative to the full and complete liberation of Palestine from the river to the sea. The chant, from the river to the sea, comes from the statement of 2017. In the same paragraph that included that famous chant, subsequent famous chant, the authors inserted a phrase that convinced some journalists that Hamas had turned a corner, had moderated its stance. And the sentence reads, quote, however, without compromising its rejection of the Zionist entity and without relinquishing any Palestinian rights, Hamas considers the establishment of a fully sovereign and independent Palestinian state, with Jerusalem as its capital along the lines of the 4th of June 1967, with the return of the refugees and the displaced to their homes from which they were expelled, to be a formula of national consensus. If the term Zionist entity is rejected, and Palestinian rights, as Hamas defined them, could not be relinquished, and the refugees had to be returned to the homes from which they were expelled, the logical implication of the 2017 statement was that the state of Israel would have to be destroyed. Quote, resisting the occupation with all means and methods, unquote, was not a reference to Israeli policy on the West Bank, but to the existence of all of Israel. Nevertheless, the statement of 2017 performed the magic trick of presenting this profoundly reactionary organization as at one with, quote, the Palestinians, serving as a cause célèbre of the global left. Following the violent seizure of power in 2007, Hamas unified ideology with policy. It became not only a terrorist organization, but also a small dictatorship whose core purpose was to wage war against Israel. It killed or jailed its opponents, famously throwing members of the Palestine Liberation Organization off roofs and buildings, intimidated the press, including the global press, and as we now know, also came to infiltrate and dominate United Nations relief organization, UNRWA. It controlled education and imposed Sharia law. It spent millions that could have been used to improve the lives of Gaza's civilians on armaments and on a stupendous construction project that could by no stretch of the imagination have been a secret to people living in Gaza, that built over 400 miles of tunnels designed for waging wars against Israel. The New York Times described the tunnel project very accurately and indicated that the 400 miles of tunnels was more mileage than the London or New York metro system. In conclusion, we are, as I said at the outset, in an era of simultaneity. Right-wing extremists in Charlottesville chanting, "The Jews will not replace us," murders at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, and Trump's conspiracy theories about assorted international actors threatening the United States stimulate ideas that eventually come around, sooner or later, to blaming the Jews. Leftists denounce Israel as a form of settler colonialism or apartheid and ignore or even justify acts of Palestinian terrorism and the repeated rejection of the two-state compromise. The attack of October 7th made clear that it is Islamism which poses the greatest danger to Israel and which remarkably has stimulated support for Hamas on some American campuses. Without addressing this form of Jew hatred and the resulting hatred of Israel, no strategy of fighting anti-Semitism in the United States can be successful. I repeat, no strategy for fighting anti-Semitism in the United States can be successful unless it addresses the Islamist dimension, and does so in ways that have nothing whatsoever to do with Donald Trump's attacks on Muslims. Nothing whatsoever to do with that. He's just made everything worse. The Islamist face of anti-Semitism and the desire to destroy the state of Israel by force of arms emerged in the 1930s. It moved away from the center of attention during the Cold War, but proudly announced its aims in Iran and in the Hamas Charter. The ideological origins of the attack of October 7th were long-standing. They were public, they were little noticed, and they were under-examined. The inclination to describe the criticism of Islamism as a form of Islamophobia confused the necessary critique of religious fanaticism, which is part of the glorious legacies of the European and American Enlightenment, or part of the glorious legacies of the American revolutionaries, who wrote the Constitution fully aware of the disasters of the war of religion in the 17th century in Europe, and wanted to have none of that here. We historians of the Nazi era refer to the problem of underestimation in the 1930s, as I mentioned a few moments ago. Too few leaders and observers took Hitler's threats seriously enough, most famously in his 1939 prophecy speech to the Reichstag, in which he promised that if the Jews started another war in Europe, the result would be the extermination of the Jewish race in Europe. The absurdity of the threat made it sound incredible. Similarly, the absurdities of the Hamas Charter of 1988 and its restatement of its determination to destroy Israel in 2017 also led too many to dismiss or ignore its clearly stated intentions, its reactionary essence, and for one English professor at the University of California at Berkeley to declare in her stupidity that the Hamas organization was a chapter of the global left. And she's a very famous professor. The blunder of underestimation was bad enough in the 1930s. We have endured a second era of underestimation, one that is less excusable in view of the lessons of the 30s and 40s. We have witnessed a deficiency of comparative historical analysis and a failure to grasp that Nazism was finished as a major force in Europe, that it had an afterlife in the history of Islamism in the Middle East. The cultural references, the language, the chants, the costumes, the slogans differed from those of the Nazis, but the war against the Jews, as Abana said in 1946, continued unabated. The road from Haj Amin al-Husseini's Islam and the Jews of 1937 to the Hamas Charter of 1988 to the tunnel construction and then the attack of October 7th is long and winding. It is not a straight and clear path. There is sound evidence that the Nazis had a role in this under-examined history. Yet, as I mentioned a few moments ago, October 7th took place 78 years after Nazi Germany was defeated. Scholars should be asking why the Jew hatred of the 1930s and 40s has been so persistent. Israel's adversaries have long had a ready answer, which I assume many of you have heard. The hatred persists because of Israeli injustice. Case closed. The Jews, or the Zionists, in other words, are guilty. This evening I have pointed to another context, an additional causal factor, a different way of interpreting independent and dependent variables, to use the language of social science. And that independent variable, that causal factor, the reason why this war took place, is the Islamist interpretation of the religion of Islam, and I want to place it in the center of scholarly attention. Scholars in our universities who ask why this war took place must have the scholarly freedom to explore the weight of all causal factors, including the weight of this ideological tradition. They must not be intimidated, they must not be denounced as racist because they want to engage in what historians have done for decades and decades and decades. It is essential to the modern profession of historical research, and that is to examine religion critically with empathy, with understanding, but also with skepticism when it turns into a form of fanaticism. Had more historians, politicians, journalists, and policy experts drawn attention to these ideas, perhaps the Hamas dictatorship could have been isolated or overthrown, or at least placed on the moral defensive many years ago. Or perhaps it might not even have come to power in the first place. And all these people who've been killed on October 7th, and all the civilians in Gaza who Hamas uses as human shields, all the thousands of people who've died and traumatized and been wounded and injured in this horrible war, perhaps they would all be alive and well. It is this historical context, the context of this long and winding path of a strange but powerful Islamist ideology that needs to receive scholarly and public attention now and in the coming months and years. My Three Faces of Anti-Semitism draws readers' attention to a body of scholarship and the work of historians of the past quarter century, to Meyer Litvak, to Robert Wistrich, to Norman Stillman, to Martin Kramer, to Matthias Kunzel. Names that should be familiar. They should be on required syllabi on courses all over the United States. Norman Stillman, Meyer Litvak, Matthias Kunzel, Martin Kramer. They should be household names for scholars, because their work offers a sound foundation for understanding the ideas in politics, which yet again were underestimated for far too long. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have some time for some questions. I asked people to write them out because there are only two of us mic'd up. So does anyone? Oh. Has Hamas, let me make sure I have it right. Has the Hamas attack of October 7th accomplished Hamas's goal?
Yes and no. The strategy, and here now I'm going to be talking about things that I assume many of you are familiar with. The strategy has been to, of course, when Mr. Sinwar planned the attack, he and the Hamas leadership must have known that this would lead to the kind of Israeli invasion that has taken place. And given the decision to fight amidst the civilians, they also must have known that many civilians in Gaza would have been killed or wounded. They must have known that no Israeli government, whether a government of General Gallant or Benny Gantz of the center-left and center, or of Netanyahu, no Israeli government after October 7th could refrain from waging a war to destroy Hamas. No government in the world would accept living next to an organization so devoted to the destruction of the state. Knowing that, and knowing that the Israeli invasion would inevitably, however many telephone calls were made to apartment buildings saying, get out of the building because there are Hamas fighters there, we're going to attack it, or however much effort Israel made, far more efforts, by the way, than the United States made in Iraq and Afghanistan to avoid civilian deaths. No matter that, Hamas knew that the toll of Gazan civilian life would be large, and that the Hamas Health Ministry was in a position to establish the numbers of people who had been killed. As of this day, no one in this room knows how many civilians have been killed in the course of this war. No one. we have the word of the Hamas Health Ministry, which is an organization that is part of what is inspired by the ideology of Hamas. Maybe its figures are accurate, maybe not. But the world press and many governments are taking those figures as accurate. So, yes, Hamas has accomplished what it set out to do in generating sympathy for its cause in around the world, and in South Africa and Brazil, leading governments to accuse the Israeli government of genocide. Norman has written very, very effectively about dismantling those arguments. So yes, in that sense, it has accomplished that goal, to fan anti-Semitism and hatred of Jews around the world. It has succeeded. Somebody who has an apocalyptic understanding of politics and thinks that the destruction of the state of Israel is going to bring about the judgment day and transform the world would also see this war as a huge success. But in real world terms, it's been a fantastic failure and an unmitigated catastrophe for the people of Gaza, not to mention the trauma and barbarity of October 7th. The question is very welcome, because what Norman and I and others who have worked on the Nazi regime have tried to do, and many of our colleagues share this aspiration. We do a very strange thing. We try to get inside the mind of Adolf Hitler. We try to get inside the mind of Joseph Goebbels. Not because we want to empathize with them or try to, quote, understand why they did what they did. No, we want to understand what they believe, because we think that what they believe about the world is important for what they do in the world. And when they say that the earth is flat, and we say, well, but Galileo had a few other ideas about that, doesn't make any difference. If they think it's flat, that's all that matters. So when you have a movement that is led by people with these kind of ideas, the normal calculations of military victory and defeat don't matter. And death, which in any reasonable way of looking at the world is a premature death is a tragedy that needs to be avoided. Bernard Lewis, the great historian of the Middle East, once joked about the Islamic Republic of Iran that the threat of nuclear retaliation was not a threat but an invitation. And he overstated the case, sure. But if you say that your life is not that important and that death is a deliverance on the path to a better world, you can't be deterred. You cannot be deterred. The prospect of retaliation is an invitation, not a threat. And that's what we've seen since October 7th in this horrible war. And Winston Churchill famously said that the Second World War was an unnecessary war. That it could, if people had seen clearly or looked clearly earlier on, then maybe a smaller war would have gotten rid of Hitler, or maybe it wouldn't even require a war. That's how I feel about. That's what I think about this war. This did not have to happen, and so we need to look at ourselves in the mirror. We, meaning the senior professors, the journalists at the most important newspapers, the politicians in Washington, the think tanks, the people who shape policy and opinion in this country. We all need to look at ourselves in the mirror and say, what could we have done since 1988 to see to it that this organization would be considered a sinister and evil bunch of lunatics, and to denounce them again and again? And maybe if we had done that, maybe if our undergraduates and our graduate students had been reading about that all these decades, all of these people would be alive and this war wouldn't have happened. It's a cliche. It's not a funny joke that what we learn from history is that people don't learn from history. But this is a moment in which we German historians, or some of us, are really, really incensed that what we thought were the most obvious lessons of the 1930s and 40s either were never learned or forgotten. I think I'm not a military expert, and this evening I'm not going to opine about the course of the war or how I think it'll turn out or if the Israelis can defeat Hamas or not. I'm not an expert on that kind of thing. But in any reasonable sense of the term, this has been a vast failure for the people of Gaza, but it has certainly fanned the flames of anti-Semitism around the world. And to understand that, again, I would suggest taking a look at Paul Berman's little classic work, Terror and Liberalism. Paul saw the Twin Towers fall. He lived in Brooklyn. And that book, he put his finger on things. Any other
questions?
Yeah.
Let me bring the mic over to you, Roy. And
I'll give shorter answers because it's getting late.
Thank you. That was a fascinating talk, really. I want to ask, I'm trying to say it in a non-inflammatory way. What do we do now? And I really liked your image of anybody with a mouse and a computer screen can go in and see, right, those articles of Hamas and those pamphlets. What do we do now that everybody with a computer mouse and a screen can see similar remarks being made from fundamental Jews, religious Zionist Jews who are currently, in the government, in main positions of power, also utilize, and I'll say it carefully, Nazi terminology, at least in what is the Israeli sort of consensus or Holocaust memory, talking about transfer of Palestinian, whether voluntary or involuntary, right? So similar extreme images are also utilized, right, in the religious Zionist.
Here, I think what's important is to have an understanding of politics, and to have. There are some people in the room here who have some political experience. It's important for people to be adult about the nature of government in Israel. Who are the decision makers? Who is waging this war? Who is in the Israeli cabinet? And who is just shouting, mouthing off, on social media? And what happened after Mr. Smotrich and Ben-Venir, shared their brilliant observations with the world, our colleague Omer Bartov and others said, you see, the Israeli government is now planning a genocide. Well, they aren't the decision makers. They aren't the decision makers. And that requires, spending some time in thinking about the nature of the Israeli cabinet. And paying attention to the fact that General Gallant and General Gantz are part of the cabinet. And they were doing everything they could to drive Netanyahu out of power. So if I were advising the Israelis, I would have said, look at Churchill, look at Roosevelt. When you're faced with an extreme situation, what you need is a consensus government. The American cliche is a bipartisan foreign policy. Yeah? And that's what Israel needed. So there's a Shakespearean dimension to the Israeli tragedy, which is that one man, Benjamin Netanyahu, held on long, much too long, and put his personal interests ahead of everything else, and that politics is about people and their virtues and their faults, and clearly this is an example in which there was a colossal intelligence and political failure. But my friends, and perhaps yours as well, spent the 10 months before October 7th painting signs and marching around the streets, trying to get the right-wing government out of power. Right? And the very same people who were marching in those things, their children are now fighting in Gaza. The attack of October 7th, and those of you who know Israel and know southern Israel and the Negev, know that a lot of the people who live in the Negev are liberal Israel, secular, liberal Israel. They're not the ultra-Orthodox. They're not the people who avoid military service. They are liberal Israel. They're the opponents of Netanyahu. That's who was murdered. Some of the people, and you've read this, some of the people who were murdered were peace activists. So this war in Israel is a war of consensus. It's not Netanyahu's war. One of the things the New York Times does, and the Washington Post, is to present views like those that I've presented this evening as conservative. Or this is what Netanyahu is saying. What they don't want to admit is that no, it's what Benny Gantz is saying. This is what General Gallant is saying. It's what Haaretz is saying on occasion. It was very sobering, and Norman and I were very angered by those accusations of genocide that came in the New York Review of Books. And so we decided, the two of us, to write a letter to the New York Review of Books. And those of you who know the New York Review of Books know that it has been consistently very antagonistic to much of Israeli politics and policy in the last 25 years. And it is influential in the professoriate, So we thought, well, the fact that these accusations were made by Bartov and by our mutual friend Christopher Browning, who we both have a great deal of respect for as a historian and as a friend, this needs an answer. So we did. And remarkably, the editors of the New York Review of Books, much to our astonishment, published our letter on December 6th. If you Google our names and the New York Review of Books, our letter is there. And it's signed by 31 other historians in Israel, in Germany, in Britain, and the United States. So it's not the case that most historians of the Holocaust share the view that Israel is engaged in genocide. It's just not the case. Do you read Dana Milbank in the Washington Post? Dana Milbank is one of the finest contemporary historians in American journalism. And so if you want to see how lunatic the Congress has become, just Google Dana Milbank. And you'll find numerous examples of people elected to the Congress of the United States who are blithering idiots and say the unbelievably stupidest thing you can imagine on a regular basis. So people abroad could say, well, look, Marjorie Greene said that they're Jewish space lasers, right? And et cetera, et cetera. You can always do that. And I think that's what happened with these accusations. If you have a chance, please read Norman's superb essay in Quillette. We wrote one together, and then you wrote one on your own about the South African accusation of genocide. And he dissected it as only a historian really can. It's a very fine piece. And if you then are really interested, even more interested in the dismantling of the South African case, take a look at Julia Sebutinde. Julia Sebutinde, I think I'm pronouncing her correct, her name correctly. Julia, she is, how many of you know that name? Not a household name. Where do you think, she is a judge on the International Criminal Court from Uganda. Very different Uganda than Idi Amin's Uganda in the 1970s. And she wrote a brilliant dissenting opinion dismantling the South African case. It's remarkable. Yet how much attention did that get in the American press? Not enough.
She was the first African woman judge on that.
Yes. And then the government of Uganda wanted to dissociate themselves from her dissenting opinion. Julia Subitende should be getting invitations at American universities, at American law schools. Make her famous. Protect her. Come to her defense.
You gonna take one more?
One more, yeah.
My question is the following.
Yeah.
United States yearly invests billions of dollars in support of Israel.
Yeah.
You were talking about the tunnels. Those tunnels were not built in one day, 1 week, a month.
Yeah.
That was happening. What the Hamas did to Israel, like you said, they were peace-loving individuals.
Yeah.
It is horrible, and we agree. But my question is, what happened to Israel intelligence, military, which, once again, we can say that this was an unnecessary war, because the reality is this, that there have been thousands of children killed by Israeli weapons. And so the question is, do the end justify the means?
It's an excellent question. And your question encourages me to probe a little more deeply into what I had to say about the problem of underestimation. Let's say I forget exactly when the various Israeli leaders were in power, but after 2007, let's say by 2010, it was becoming apparent to Israeli intelligence and the Israeli military that Hamas was engaged in a massive construction project of building tunnels, and that these are intelligent people, and that they understood that the reason for building the tunnels was to wage war against Israel. At that point, historians will learn, decades from now, if there were discussions within the Israeli military and in the Prime Minister's office of whether or not Israel should launch a preemptive invasion in 2010 or 2012, when the tunnel construction was in its infancy. And Benjamin Netanyahu, time and again, said no. And here is where the Shakespearean dimension and the fact that political leaders are human beings is important to take into account, for precisely the reason you mentioned, because every Israeli military and political leader knew that if they invaded Gaza, that it would be the kind of disaster for the civilians of Gaza that has taken place. And so you think, well, if I launch a preemptive war against Hamas before Hamas has done something like October 7th, I know very well that around the world it's going to be called the war of Israeli aggression and imperialism. Well, Israelis, out of the blue, they attacked Hamas. Oh, Hamas has this charter, but, people can say whatever they want. So there's that. And then there's something else. The economy in Gaza was booming. New shopping centers, Mercedes-Benz, universities, the seaside, lavish homes on the beach. It wasn't an open-air prison. Qatar was sending money. And so the calculation, if you're Netanyahu or one of the other Israeli leaders, is, look, they say this rubbish in the charter, but it's not the 7th century. Everybody knows it's not the 7th century. They can't possibly believe that stuff. Well, let's just pour in more money and buy them off. Maybe just comfort, maybe a car, maybe a Gucci handbag, maybe shopping centers with escalators. Maybe that'll get them to change their views. Because if the alternative is going to war, shouldn't we give it a chance? Maybe materialism will erode the ideological fanaticism. And I think that that was part of the thinking. Obviously, it turned out to be terribly mistaken. But if you're the decision maker, the decision to go to war is the worst possible one that you want to make. And so Netanyahu is often criticized as the hawk and all that. Didn't want to go to war. Maybe something else would work. You could say the same thing about Angela Merkel. Where was Angela Merkel when Putin was killing people, his opponents in Russia? She speaks Russian. Didn't she see? How could she be so naive? Why didn't Germany's military budget, why wasn't it spending 10% of the budget on defense in 2010? And the reason is that she hoped that if you engage the Russians in business and you're buying all their oil, well, why the hell would they want to go to war with you? And if the alternative is this tension and possible conflict, isn't that better? So the specifics of what happened on October 7th involved some macho guys in the intelligence agencies not listening to some women in the intelligence agencies who were right about what was coming. And there are many details about it that we don't know, and we'll learn more. So on that, nobody debates that it was a colossal failure. But if the advocates of But a preemptive war 10 years earlier would have killed a lot fewer people. But it didn't happen because people hoped it would not be necessary. And in that sense, I think I'll conclude with this. After Neville Chamberlain died, Winston Churchill gave a eulogy at his funeral. And if it's on the web, you can Google Churchill's eulogy for Chamberlain. So Churchill didn't say, Neville Chamberlain was a blithering idiot. He was a man who had this naive hope that the Nazis would want peace. What a jerk. No, he said he did all his best. He did his best to avoid another war, but a wicked man brought this war about, not Neville Chamberlain. And so what are you going to do? Criticize Neville Chamberlain because he didn't want to go to war? Well, in retrospect, it was a mistake, But and I think realizing that the Israeli leaders are people, and they didn't want to go to, because they knew this would be a major war, a very big one. And the message of historians, like Norman and myself, about the realities of ideological fanaticism, it's easy for us to speak that way because we don't have the weight of the world on our shoulders. We're not going to be sending young people into battle. But they do. They have that responsibility. So I hope that what I've said this evening might inspire some of you to become historians. Because what we do is enormously important. And so I think enough said with that. I think that's a good place to conclude.
Thank you so much for the talk. Before we hit the wonderfully Beautiful catered lunch back there. You get one more commercial about the Shorstein Center. The second in the series, Understanding the New Anti-Semitism, is on April 2nd. The speaker will be Susie Linfield of New York University, who wrote a wonderful book called The Lion's Den, Zionism and the Left, from Hannah Arendt to Noam Chomsky. But before that, the 13th annual Gainesville Jewish Film Festival. There are programs in the back, and it hits our website tomorrow. 12 wonderful films from all over the world, most of which will be at the Hippodrome. Free, no charge to get in. These are films from Europe, from Israel, from the United States, from South America, just some of the best Jewish films or Jewish-themed films to come out this year. It's a wonderful festival now in its 13th year. So I hope to see some of you there, and I hope to see you at our